Well, thank you for tuning in again today. We've got another little session that we want to add to the knowledge that we've given you thus far about how inner healing works, some of the things you have to deal with, and one of the things that has been a significant piece in it is trauma. Now, Jesus said that in this world you will have tribulation, and obviously trauma fits into that category extremely well. He didn't say maybe you will have it. He just promised us that this was going to happen. Now, quite obviously, the reason that we have trauma involved in our lives is we have an enemy, the enemy of our souls, the enemy of God Himself, and the enemy of His purposes in the earth, and you are one of those purposes. So part of His strategy is to bring trauma into your life in order to subvert your purpose in the earth. Now, this thing on trauma was kind of new to me in some sense, but a number of years ago, I think this was 2008, I had about a dozen young ladies come to me who were really struggling. The interesting thing about it, I'm not sure that it was any magic, but all of these young ladies were under 30, all single, and all suffering the same kind of circumstances. They were experiencing tormenting dreams. And so their desire to go to sleep was hampered significantly by the fact that they knew what they were going to encounter when they lay their heads on the pillow. It had gone on for a lengthy enough period of time that it began to affect them physically. Every army in the world knows how to elicit information from another combatant, and that is, if we can deprive you of sleep, you will tell me anything they think you need to know in order to be able to go to sleep. Now, what happens also is, because you and I, even though Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5:23 said, I would you were sanctified wholly, spirit, soul, and body, in that he was able to parse the essence of our being into three different pieces just for the purpose of discussion. The reality is that I'm one individual in three pieces, and I cannot separate them. So what happens in one element of my body, or one element in my spirit, or one element in my emotions impacts the balance of it. One of the things that we found out in running healing rooms over the years is that 85% of the things that people suffer from physically have their root in either an emotional or a spiritual issue. So if you're going to pray for healing for somebody, that's in essence picking fruit. You're going to have to deal with the emotional or spiritual issue that caused it in the first place, or it will come back again. So here was a situation with these young ladies, and I'm interested always in getting to the root of issues, is what's the real cause of it? And so I had followed the Holy Spirit as far as I felt like I could go, and just kind of put a dent in it. It really didn't impact it for any length of time at all. In fact, most of it was about 36 hours. Well, these young ladies were obviously being single, had jobs, had other responsibilities, and in the process of struggling with tormenting dreams and so forth, and the inability to sleep, it was impacting every other area of their lives as well. So it was hard for them to function. It was hard for them to make decisions. And when that happens to you, you begin to do what most of us do, and that's begin to isolate, which is the very thing the enemy wants you to do, because his ultimate goal is to get you so miserable and isolate yourself from those who love you and will pray for you and help you, you'll want to pull the plug. And obviously, those who have suffered with trauma for any significant period of time have indeed done that. Now, the situation with trauma is very interesting from the standpoint that it impacts every individual differently, dependent upon your capacity, your maturity level, and your ability to get back to a place of joy and stability emotionally. Now, that's kind of independent of how you were raised, but there's a significant part of that, of how you were raised, that has a significant impact on your ability to get back to joy. And we'll discuss that in a little bit. But what I really wanted to do for you initially is at least give you some sense of what people deal with normally in the context of trauma. And we can do that best by looking at the criteria for diagnosis that psychologists have come up with. And I think obviously a definition of trauma is certainly in order. And DSM-4 proposes this: a person who has been exposed to a traumatic event in which both of the following were present. Number one, the person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event or events that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of themselves or others. Or number two, the person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror. The traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in one or more of the following ways. Number one, recurrent or intrusive distressing recollections of the event, including images, thoughts, or perceptions. This is kind of what's called flashbacks. Individuals will be driving down the road, working, or what have you, and all of a sudden something triggers the remembrance of this event. Now, when it comes with everything that was associated with it, including physical sensations, smells, tastes, the whole gamut. Number two is the recurrent distressing dreams of the event. Now, this is kind of interesting because the enemy does a couple of things, and when talking about recurring dreams, you're really talking about thematically. In other words, if there was serious injury and helplessness, which might have been caused by, let's say, violence against the individual, there would be different people involved, there would be different circumstances, but the same events would occur continuously in each and every dream. And typically what I have experienced also is individuals come to me and demons are actually a part of this, playing the part of the individual who violated them. And so not only is there the repercussions from what physically happened to them in the event itself, but there's also the fear that is engendered when they encounter this demonic entity who carries fear in the context of their dream. And so it's multiplied in a sense. Acting or feeling as if the traumatic event were recurring includes a sense of reliving the experience, illusions, hallucinations, dissociative flashback episodes, including those that occur awakening or when intoxicated. Now, this is an interesting experience for people because dissociation typically occurs for us in the context of significant trauma. And this is generally the case with children. It is a God-given ability in that allows us not to have to process all of the emotion and everything that goes with it, all the violations, the violence, the betrayals, everything else. Allows us to package it up, put it on the shelf, so that when we grow a little older, we're a little more mature, we have resources we didn't have, we have a support system that we didn't have, we can take it down off the shelf and properly process it. This is a God-given ability for individuals to dissociate. The difficulty with it is this, is that when it happens as a young child, this becomes the modus operandi that we apply to every significant, emotionally troubling event that occurs in our lives. So when an individual initially dissociates, this becomes multiple situations, even if those situations do not warrant or are not even on the scale of the original traumatic event that they experienced. And so this is often one of the issues where individuals come to us and they're experiencing all kinds of different difficulties because of the dissociation. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but this is one of the significant things that occurs as a result of significant trauma, especially when you're very young. Another one is the intense psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble the aspect of the traumatic event. I remember as a child riding in the back seat of my parents' cars. We're driving through the city of New Orleans. And I was sitting behind my dad, who was driving at the time, and looking out the window, and here's the grill of a 70s model something or another that plowed into the side of the car. Well, my head hit the window, but there was no significant injury as a result of it. However, whenever I smell radiator fluid on hot asphalt, I get that image perfectly clear, and it is the entire image, not just the thought. I can see this massive vehicle coming toward us and experience the whole thing all over again. So if a traumatic event such as a rape or some violence or a robbery or anything of that nature happens to you, the trigger mechanisms that are associated with it are tied to the event itself. And so they become the smells, the taste, the sounds, music, feelings, the environment itself. Maybe it happened on a tree. We had a young lady who came to us who was raped under an apple tree. She could not eat an apple or smell the fragrance of an apple or a scented candle without experiencing that whole thing all over again. So these things are all tied together, and that's why I say again, you cannot separate these things. We're one being, spiritually, physically, emotionally. Everything is tied together. This goes on to say that some of the things that are characteristic or persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma and numbing of general responsiveness as indicated by 3 or more of the following. Efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma. Obviously, anything that reminds them of that something they're not interested in doing. And so oftentimes what happens, an individual will not decide to, or will decide not to come to counseling or to any kind of ministry because they are afraid that they will be reminded or have to speak of that event again and suffer the same things over and over again. Now let me inject a little bit of spiritual history here. When Satan was kicked out of heaven, he was mad at God, he was mad at you, he was mad at all the purposes of God, he was even mad at the earth, because this is where he was confined to. And so the purpose for trauma is this. is to grab hold of you for the purpose of future torment. So unless you deal with the spiritual aspect of it, it is going to be extremely difficult to deal with all of the emotional and physical results of trauma as well. And we'll go into how you do that. But the reality is you and I have an enemy who hates us and will do anything to wreck your life. Okay? What does wreck your life look like? Jesus said, "I am come that you might have life and life abundant." So anything that doesn't look like life to you, most of which would include fear, instances of abandonment and rejection, on and on and on. Okay? These things are meant to rob us of life, which Jesus said that was his purpose in John 10. He comes for no other reason than to rob, steal, kill, and destroy. So to the fact that you have an enemy who wants to use the environment against you, wants to use people against you, wants to use those who are demonically oppressed, impressed, and depressed. These are the makings of trauma. Not to mention just simple accidents and injuries and those kinds of things. The other things are avoiding efforts, avoiding activities, places, or people that arouse recollections of the trauma. So there are places that people decide they will never go to again. Now, one of the interesting things about that is when you and I make a vow as a result of a traumatic event, it creates a law in our lives. I remember I started to look it up when it was, but the original movie War of the Worlds, probably 1959 or 60, somewhere around in there. I was 10, 11, staring over the back seat of the station wagon that my parents had. They had taken us to the drive-in movies with the little box that hangs on the side of your car with the speaker. And I'm watching this movie. Well, there's not much of a plot to this movie. Aliens come, it's wanton destruction, mass destruction, senseless killing of human beings. And at some point in time during that movie, as I'm leaning over the back seat, I could not stand the violence anymore. And I hit the floor of that 1953 Dodge station wagon and never got up. The vow that I made is when I get old enough, I will never watch another movie like that. Well, Pat and I get married, and she loves movies. But characteristically, she not only loves movies, but she loves a particular kind of movie. She loves violent movies. She loves movies with suspense and drama. And I mean, the only movie that she could not watch, or television series, was 24, because that guy got beat up in every in every episode. It's got, this is enough. But what would happen is she would see an advertisement for a movie and say, "I want to go see this movie." And I would reluctantly say, "Okay, I'll go." And it is not 10 minutes into this thing, and I'm standing out in the lobby looking at posters of coming attractions. So what happened is I had made this vow, and it becomes the law that you live by. It's unconscious, but it is still operative, still active, and it works. So along comes well, I don't even know what year it was. It was the remake of the movie with Tom Cruise. And I thought, okay, Pat's gonna want to go to this thing. I need to watch the movie with her. So Lord, you're going to have to show me what happened and why this is an issue for me. Well, he takes me back to that memory, gives me the vow, so I repent. We go to see the movie. It was as plotless as the first one was. The only saving grace of it was the special effects that were in it, because they were pretty awesome. But the movie was awful. But at least I was able to go. See, this is the kind of things that the enemy is trying to trap you into, is not only causing these things to happen, trauma to happen, but using them against you, even relationally, okay? Because Pat assumed that the reason I didn't want to go to a movie is I didn't want to do anything she wanted to do. Well, how hurtful is that? So the enemy is all about destroying as much as he can, including every relationship of people that weren't even impacted by the trauma that you experienced when you were 5, 6, 7, 10, 11, whatever it turns out to be. So on it goes. Number 3, an inability to recall an important aspect of the trauma. This is interesting on a couple of levels, because historically what we have bought into, as the Lord has provided it, is Christian therapies that engage us with the Lord in a difficult or emotionally troubling memory, pain-filled, hopefully. And this was given to us by Mr. Ed Smith through Theophostic, 20 years ago or so. Well, one of the things that the enemy is aware of is this is the case. And so if individuals suppress a memory of a traumatic event for an extraordinarily long period of time, 10, 20 years or so, the reality is if you don't use it, you lose it. The memory is still there, but the connectivity to get to it is not there. So if your freedom is tied to having to recall a specific traumatic memory to engage the Lord with, you have a difficulty of getting healed over that thing, do you not? Well, fortunately, the Lord was one step ahead of him, so we have another couple of tools that you can use to get to that. But this is how thorough the enemy wants to work in dealing with us human beings when he causes trauma, is let's slow down the healing process as much as we possibly can. The next one is markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities. One of the things that comes along with it is not only the isolation which we spoke of before, but the sense of hypervigilance against future trauma. And so what we wind up doing, as I have spoken of before, is he wants to get you out of your heart and into your head, so that you have to look at every situation and assess it for its ability to harm you. It takes an incredible amount of emotional energy to do that over every issue in your life. Now, it's interesting for these young ladies who came, how to say this delicately. The more intelligent you are, the longer you can hold out doing this. Typically, things begin to fall apart when you're about 24. But if you're extremely intelligent, you can hang on to these kinds of things well into your 40s. And I've known a couple of guys who were pushing 60 but they were genius level kinds of people. But eventually it will all fall apart because you do not have typically the kind of emotional energy that it takes to keep it all together in this process. Feeling detached and estranged from others. Restricted range of effect. In other words, you're unable to feel loved. And that's a hard thing for people to appreciate, because those who love them and care for them certainly want them to understand and feel that they are cared for, that there's compassion for them, and so forth and so on. But what happens is we emotionally shut down portions of ourselves so that I don't get hurt quite as easily. And that restricts our ability to receive love, which makes our problem even that much more difficult to recover from. And then there is a sense of foreshortened future. And particularly if these are significant, because you don't expect to have a career, marriage, children, normal lifespan, those kinds of things. Hopelessness comes in. Because initially we can respond reasonably well to significant traumas. But the longer it goes on, the less hope we have. And if you lose hope, you lose faith. And if you lose faith, then there isn't seemingly any help for you. It goes on to say, persistent symptoms of increased arousal is indicated by 2 or more of the following: difficulty falling or staying asleep, irritability or outbursts of anger, difficulty concentrating, hypervigilance, an exaggerated startle response. That last one, I've run into 2 or 3 people who that was one of their issues. People coming through a door, for instance, into a room where they belong with family members. Screen door slams, garage door closes, they freak out. Had a couple who were struggling because if he turned over in the bed would squeak and she would bolt out of bed as though something was after her. And she could not get to sleep for an hour. It would take her to calm down and go back to bed, even though she knew this was going to happen. You know, this thing can tell you exactly what's going to happen, but it is this thing that runs the show. Okay? For us, typically what we see when individuals come to us is, I don't know who I am. I don't know my purpose. I'm distant from God and other individuals. I can't tell you the last time I was able to connect with the Lord. And when all of these things conspire against you, it takes a significant amount of toll on your ability to hold a job, progress, and that kind of thing. And so one of the things that happens with us is we see an awful lot of people on the basis of love offering. Because if that is one of your major issues, earning money is also one of your major issues. And so as a consequence, many people who suffer from trauma can't afford to get traditional mental health care. They can't afford to go to counselors, especially on a weekly basis. And particularly if it's only cognitive-oriented therapy, where we're just talking about your situation and giving you some tools that you have to be disciplined enough to act, to see any improvement. As I said before, if you don't choose to deal with the spiritual implications, the real root of why this happened, it's going to be difficult for you to go through the process and recover from trauma. Now, one of the interesting things that we find statistically is that 1 in 8 women have been sexually molested, 60% of them before 18 years of age. So the vast number of individuals who are experiencing trauma come not from accidents and injuries and violence and those kinds of things, but sexual assault. And it has a profound effect on the individual because it not only touches you emotionally, but it touches you spiritually. So it impacts your identity as a human being. And what we found over the years in working with individuals is if you cannot heal the wounds of your human spirit, if you work only with the emotional part, then you cannot sustain your healing for an extended period of time. Now, the tools that work for emotional healing also work for spiritual. You just have to direct them there with some intentionality. But if you don't do it, you're only doing part of the job that is necessary for helping people recover from trauma. And that's one of the inner healing tools that we want to talk to you about is ministry to the human spirit. Because within your human spirit is your identity. There is your purpose. And that's precisely what the enemy is after. He does not want you to fulfill your purpose in the earth. Paul said, there are good works established for you to perform before the foundation of the world. David said, before there was one day in my mother's womb, you had every day written, every one of my days written in your book. There are things that you and I are to accomplish. And the enemy knows quite well, if you are able to accomplish him, his job is going to be really, really hard, if not virtually impossible. And so he has not only to fight against you, he's got to fight against your purpose. Otherwise, his revenge will be totally incomplete, if not non-existent. So there's all kinds of little things that you need to be aware of. Now, one of the other things that happens to us is a thing called secondary trauma. Mental health workers, individuals in hospitals, law enforcement are very, very much aware of this. It comes from hearing the stories or seeing the carnage as a result of something that happened to somebody else, and yet it impacts you. We got asked to go to Jordan, which in northern Jordan, which is just on the 15 miles or so from the Syrian border, to minister to a group of female missionaries who were assisting the Syrian refugees. In northern Jordan, there's 1.5 million Syrian refugees. Now, these individuals come with nothing. Whatever they can carry, the clothes on their back, and whatever things that they find to be precious, which is typically a pot to cook something in. And they have nothing else. So the United Nations has provided them the absolute minimum. The absolute minimum is simply a tent with some cooking equipment to it, pots to carry water in. They have to do the rest. So in other words, they can go to a place where they can get food for their family once a day. So these missionaries were doing just service kinds of things. In other words, they were buying 5-gallon tanks of propane and a heater so that in the wintertime, and it is extremely cold, their children wouldn't die. That's one of the most significant things that happens to them, is the loss of the younger children due to the cold during the wintertime. And in the process of getting to know these people, they were fighting all kinds of things. Number one, Muslim countries do not respect women whatsoever. They don't have a place, they don't have a voice. You cannot walk down the street and engage a man eye to eye. You can't look at him. You can't ride a bicycle, and in many cases you can't even drive a car. The language is extraordinarily difficult to learn because the vast majority of local Muslims are speaking in colloquialisms rather than classic Arabic. And so there's just lots of difficulties that they're going through. Every building in Jordan and pretty much the Middle East is either made of stone or concrete blocks, which are the hardest things to heat in the wintertime. So virtually everybody wears whatever they're wearing outside, they wear inside during the wintertime. Because electricity is so expensive, you can imagine how much fun it is to take a cold shower when when it's, it's 50 or 55 degrees in your house. But this is what life is. It's hard. But to make things extremely difficult for them, what was happening was that they were hearing these horror stories of what these individuals went through in Syria that caused them to leave. If you're sensitive, close your ears. One of the ladies was told, well, the base leader basically said this, said, "What do I tell a man who comes and says, I held my infant son above my head and I had to tell people who I was for, whether I was for Assad or I was for the rebels, and they didn't believe me, and I wear the brains and the blood of my son's head all over me." These young ladies, generally all under about 25 or 26, hear these things, impacts you significantly. You can't unhear it. You can't forget the mental images that come as a result of hearing these stories. The difficulty is that there was no mother and father in that company that they could come to and unload this stuff. After about 18 months, even though each of them had given a 2-year commitment, they were burned out. They were toast. They couldn't do anymore. And so their ability to even minister to Syrian refugees was limited to what can I do to physically carry canisters of propane and a heater. I don't want to hear any more stories. I can't hear another story. It's things like this. We were asked to come down to Sutherland Springs the week after the church shooting in which 26 people were murdered in a Baptist church, and 23 others were sent in various conditions to the hospital. And we prayed for family members, friends, and the individuals who were in the hospital. You can't unsee what you saw. You can't unhear what you heard. Sutherland Springs is a community of less than 500, which means that on that day, 9% of the population suffered casualties. So everybody in that community was connected to someone who was either died or severely wounded. 2 of the last individuals just got out of the hospital 3 weeks ago. And this was November the 5th when it happened. They're fortunate in that the government itself has brought a number of resources available to them. The state of Texas has done it, and even the Southern Baptist Convention had done it. But the difficulty for everybody in the community is virtually every one of those organizations left right before Thanksgiving, the Christmas holidays, which are the hardest times for individuals who lose loved ones to go through. You see, you and I, being members of the body of Christ, have an ability because of who we know, who we're connected with, and the abilities and the desires that he gives us to love our fellow men, that go far beyond the reach of the government or any other agency to heal, restore, and comfort those who have lost things. That, to me, is the boat we're missing. You see, as the church in America, we have not only the manpower, but we have the power to make a profound difference in our communities. The trauma prayer that was recorded, that is up on YouTube, you can just search my name, Jim Banks, and trauma prayer, has been downloaded either from YouTube, Vimeo, or our website over 1 million times. There are more than 20,000 people who go to sleep to it every night, because it has the ability to be able to deal with some of the spiritual implications of what individuals are going through. The Prince of Peace comes to your bedside. I wish I had $1 for every time it's been downloaded. But the Lord wouldn't let us charge for it. And I'm grateful that he hasn't, because it has ministered to so many people in so many different ways. We're going to take a break.